Someone says something that should hit you emotionally. Maybe it's praise. Maybe it's criticism. Maybe it's an invitation to be vulnerable, and within seconds, your mind has transformed it into an interesting puzzle to analyze. You're already 3 steps removed from the feeling. It's examining the psychology of why they said it. What cultural forces shaped their perspective, what this reveals about human nature. And while your mind races through these fascinating connections, the moment passes. The person in front of you sees your eyes go distant. They can feel you leaving, climbing into that tower in your head where you're safe, where you're brilliant, where you never have to simply feel the raw ache of being human. This is the hidden cost of being a deep thinker. Not the obvious price, the social awkwardness, the difficulty with small talk, the tendency to overthink decisions. No, the real cost is subtler and more profound. It's the way thinking itself becomes a refuge from the very life you're trying to understand. Before the end of this video, we'll explore how the thinking function, that remarkable capacity to see patterns, make connections, and grasp complexity, can transform from psychology's greatest gift into a sophisticated defense mechanism. More importantly, we'll examine what happens when you become conscious of this pattern and learn to integrate the head and the heart without losing the depth that makes you who you are. Welcome to Deep Psyche Lab, where we explore the depths of Jungian psychology to help you understand yourself at the deepest levels. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to making Carl Jung's profound insights accessible and personally transformative. I invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss these explorations of the psyche. This is a space for people who think deeply and feel deeply. So even if we don't always know, we're doing both. The deep thinker sits at the intersection of gift and shadow, blessing and curse. Let's begin by understanding what we're actually talking about when we use this term. In Jungian psychology, thinking is one of 4 primary psychological functions, the others being feeling, sensation, and intuition. For some people, thinking is their dominant function, their primary way of engaging with and making sense of the world. But we're not just talking about intelligence here. Plenty of intelligent people aren't deep thinkers. And plenty of deep thinkers struggled in traditional educational settings because their minds work differently. They need to understand the why beneath the what, to see the patterns connecting seemingly unrelated ideas, to follow a thought down into its roots, even when everyone around them has moved on to the next topic. A true deep thinker experiences the world primarily through the lens of meaning-making and analysis. When you encounter an experience, your first instinct isn't to ask, "How do I feel about this?" but "What does this mean? How does this connect to other things I know? What's the underlying structure here?" This isn't a choice you make consciously, it's as natural as breathing. Your mind is constantly building models, testing theories, seeking the principles that explain phenomena. This capacity is genuinely remarkable. Deep thinkers are the ones who see the pattern before others notice there's something to look at. They're the philosophers, the systems designers, the people who can hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously and find a framework that contains them both. In a conversation, while others are reacting emotionally to what's being said, you're tracking the logical structure of the argument, noticing the assumptions, spotting the places where the reasoning breaks down. Jung himself was a deep thinker, though he spent much of his life learning to integrate this with his powerful intuition and eventually his feeling function. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes how his early life was dominated by intense internal contemplation hours spent alone, thinking about philosophical and spiritual questions that troubled him. Even as a child, he constructed elaborate intellectual frameworks to make sense of his experiences. This wasn't escapism. It was his genuine mode of engagement with reality. The world needs deep thinkers. You're the ones who don't accept superficial explanations, who push past the obvious answers into territory that makes others uncomfortable. When everyone else is caught up in the emotion of a situation, you can step back and see the broader context. You can hold space for complexity in a culture that craves simple answers. You notice the inconsistencies in collective narratives and have the courage to point them out. Even when it makes you unpopular, think about how this shows up in everyday life. You're in a meeting at work, and someone proposes a solution that everyone seems excited about. But you can immediately see 3 ways it could backfire. Not because you're negative, but because your mind automatically runs scenarios and tests assumptions. Or you're reading a book that everyone loves, but you find yourself frustrated because the author hasn't thought through the implications of their own argument. While others are swept up in the emotional resonance of the prose, you're having an internal argument with the logical structure. This can feel lonely. Not everyone wants to go as deep as you naturally go. Not everyone has the patience to follow the thread of a complex idea through all its permutations. And so you learn to stay quiet sometimes. To not share the 17 thoughts you've had about the simple question someone just asked. Because you've seen the glazed look in people's eyes too many times. But here's what we need to examine now. What Jung understood from his own experience and his work with patients, thinking can become not just a gift, but a defense. The castle of the mind can become a prison. There's a moment that happens in the life of every deep thinker. Though it usually happens so quickly you don't notice it. Someone or something touches an emotional, nervous childhood wound, current fear, a longing you haven't admitted even to yourself. And in that instant, before the feeling can fully arrive, your thinking function kicks in like a bodyguard. Creating distance through analysis, your partner says, "I feel like you're never really present with me," instead of letting that land emotionally. Feeling the pang of guilt, or the fear of inadequacy, or the grief of disconnection, your mind immediately starts working. What do they mean by present? Is this about their attachment style? They had an anxious mother, so they probably have hypervigilant expectations around attention. I should explore the research on presence and intimacy. This is really interesting from a psychological perspective. And just like that, you've escaped the feeling. You've turned an emotional moment into an intellectual problem. This is what Jung called the shadow of the thinking function, the way our greatest strength becomes our primary method of avoiding what we can't yet face. Jung noticed in his clinical work that patients often use their dominant function as a defense mechanism against their inferior function. For thinking types, the inferior function is feeling, not emotion in general, but the capacity for evaluation and connection, for knowing what truly matters to you, for experiencing the subjective weight of value. When thinking is overdeveloped and feeling is underdeveloped, you end up living in a world of fascinating ideas about life, while somehow remaining disconnected from life itself. This shadow manifests in subtle ways. You can analyze your childhood trauma with remarkable insight, mapping out exactly how your parents' dysfunction created your attachment patterns. You can explain to others the neurobiological basis of anxiety or depression. But when someone asks, "How are you feeling right now?" you find yourself oddly blank, reaching for concepts instead of emotions. You might say, "I'm experiencing what seems to be a stress response," when what you mean is, "I'm scared." The deep thinker's shadow isn't stupidity, it's a sophisticated form of dissociation. You learn to live a few feet above your actual experience, observing and analyzing yourself rather than being yourself. You become an expert on the human condition while struggling to fully inhabit your own humanity. Jung saw this pattern in the Estelda, archetype of the Senex, the old wise man, who holds all knowledge but has become rigid, cut off from the vitality of life. The Senex sits in his tower surrounded by books, growing increasingly certain of his understanding of the world, while the world itself passes him by. It's a cautionary image for the thinker who has lost balance. There's another archetypal pattern that illuminates this: the myth of Odin. The Norse god who sacrificed his eye to drink from the well of wisdom. Odin gains tremendous knowledge. He can see patterns across time, understand the hidden mechanisms of fate, speak to the dead, and divine the future. But the price is immediate and embodied. He loses half his vision, half his connection to the direct sensory experience of the world. He becomes the wanderer, forever seeking more wisdom to justify what he's lost, using knowledge to fill the void where simple being used to live. This myth captures something essential about the deep thinker's journey. There is a real sacrifice involved. When you develop the capacity to think at depth, to see the complex reality beneath surface appearances, you do lose a kind of innocence. a simple way of being in the world. You can't unthink what you've understood. You can't return to naive participation in collective beliefs once you've seen through them. But the question is whether the sacrifice stops at healthy loss or becomes an ongoing amputation. Whether you've given up an eye for wisdom or whether you're now giving up your heart, your body, your connection to others, all to feed the insatiable hunger of the mind that promises if you just think hard enough. You'll finally understand everything and be safe. In relationships, this shadow creates a particular kind of pain. You can love someone deeply, but when they're upset with you, your first response is to debate the validity of their perception rather than acknowledge their hurt. You can intellectually understand that your partner needs emotional attunement, but in the moment, you find yourself explaining why they shouldn't feel the way they feel because their reasoning is based on a cognitive distortion. The other person experiences this as coldness, as rejection, as proof that you don't really care. But from your perspective, you do care. You're trying to help them see the situation more clearly so they'll feel better. You're offering the gift of your thinking, which is how you've learned to navigate pain. The tragedy is that you're both sincere and missing the point entirely. They don't need your analysis of their feelings. They need you to feel with them. To be emotionally present in a way that requires you to temporarily set aside the safety of your analytical distance. This is where we need to pause and look at something many deep thinkers resist acknowledging. The possibility that all this thinking, all this analysis, all this seeking of deeper understanding might sometimes be in service of not feeling. Not because you're cold or unfeeling, but because at some point in your development, you learned that thinking was safer than feeling. Maybe. You grew up in a household where emotions were chaotic or dangerous, expressed through rage or manipulation or overwhelming need. Your thinking function became a survival tool, a way to predict and control an unpredictable emotional environment. If you could just figure out the rules, understand the patterns, think your way through the chaos, maybe you could be safe. Or maybe you were the sensitive child who felt things deeply. And at some point, someone shamed you for that sensitivity, called you too much, or too intense, or too emotional. So you learned to retreat into your head, where feelings could be converted into interesting psychological phenomena to study rather than overwhelming experiences to endure. Or maybe you discovered early that your mind was your value, your worth, your ticket to acceptance. You were praised for being smart, for asking good questions, for having insights. But nobody really saw or valued your heart, your vulnerability, your simple need to be loved without having to be brilliant. And so the thinking function grew strong and capable, while the feeling function remained undeveloped. Like a muscle you never learned to use, whatever the origin, the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. You get better and better at thinking, more sophisticated in your analyses, more capable of complex reasoning. Your mind becomes a place of genuine strength and competence. Meanwhile, the emotional realm becomes increasingly foreign, increasingly threatening, increasingly something you observe in others but don't quite trust in yourself. Before we go further, I want to ask something of you. If this exploration is resonating, if you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, take a moment to like this video. It helps others who need this perspective find their way here. And it lets me know this deep work matters to you. Now, let's look at what Jung called the individuation process. The path toward wholeness that requires integrating what we've kept in shadow. For the deep thinker, individuation doesn't mean giving up thinking. It doesn't mean becoming less analytical or dumbing yourself down to fit in with a culture that often fears complexity. What it means is developing the inferior functional learning to feel with the same depth and sophistication that you think. This is terrifying for most deep thinkers because it requires giving up control. Thinking gives you the illusion of mastery. If you can understand something, conceptualize it, fit it into a framework, it feels contained. But feeling doesn't work that way. Feelings arise unbidden. They don't follow logical rules. You can't think your way out of grief or analyze yourself out of fear. Emotions have their own intelligence, their own timing, their own truths that don't always make rational sense. Jung himself had to undergo this process. The Red Book, his private journal of his confrontation with the unconscious, documents his descent into the feeling realm. The man who had built his career on intellectual brilliance had to learn to sit with images and emotions that made no logical sense, to surrender to the symbolic and the irrational, to let himself be moved by forces he couldn't control or fully understand. It was humbling, disorienting, and ultimately transformative. In Jungian terms, the deep thinker needs to develop their feeling function not as a weakness to overcome, but as a complement to their thinking strength. True wisdom requires both. You need the capacity to analyze and understand, and you need the capacity to evaluate and connect, to know what has value and weight and meaning in the subjective. Personal sense, this integration doesn't happen through more thinking through, reading more books about emotions, or developing better theories about feelings. It happens through experience, through practice, through the scary, awkward process of actually letting yourself feel, without immediately converting the feeling into an idea about the feeling. It happens in small moments. You're feeling anxious, and instead of immediately diagnosing whines, instead of tracking back to the childhood origin or the neurochemical explanation, you just let yourself be anxious for a moment. You notice where it lives in your body. You breathe with it. You let it be wordless and unexplained. Someone compliments you, and instead of deflecting with humor or minimizing their praise or analyzing why they said it, you pause and let yourself actually receive it. Let it touch you. Let yourself feel the warmth of being seen and valued. You're angry at someone, and instead of immediately constructing the rational argument for why your anger is justified, or conversely, why it's an overreaction based on past patterns, you just let yourself be angry. You feel the heat of it, the energy of it, the way it wants to move in your body. These seem like small things, but for the deep thinker, they're revolutionary. They represent a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own experience. From observer to participant, from analyst to inhabitant of your own life. In relationships, this integration transforms everything. When your partner expresses hurt, instead of your mind immediately spinning up to defend or explain or reframe, you can pause and actually feel the impact of having hurt them. You can let that matter to you not as an interesting problem, but as a weight you carry, as something that touches your heart. And from that place of genuine feeling, your response becomes completely different. You're not trying to win an argument, or prove a point, or fix a problem. You're just two people trying to navigate the difficulty of being human together. This doesn't mean you lose your thinking capacity. Your ability to analyze, to see patterns, to grasp complexity, those gifts remain. But they become integrated with something deeper and more whole. You can think deeply and feel deeply. You can analyze a situation and also be moved by it. You can understand the psychological mechanisms at play while simultaneously being a participant rather than just an observer. The fairy tale of Iron Hans, which Jung references in his discussion of masculine psychology, offers an image of this integration. In the story, a young prince discovers a wild man Iron Hans living at the bottom of a pond. The wild man is imprisoned, covered in rust, representing the instinctual, feeling nature that has been repressed and locked away. The prince must free Iron Hans, even though this is forbidden and dangerous. And it's only through this connection with the wild, instinctual energy that the prince can eventually come into his true power and wholeness. For the deep thinker, this wild man is the feeling function, messy, unpredictable, covered in the rust of years of neglect, potentially dangerous if released without consciousness. But until you free him, until you allow that instinctual, feeling nature back into your life, you remain only half yourself. Living in the castle of the mind, while the body and heart remain imprisoned, you might be wondering what this looks like practically. How you actually begin to recognize when you're using thinking as armor and how to choose differently. Here are the signs to watch for. Notice when you're in a situation that should be emotional and you find yourself suddenly in your head, observing yourself from a distance. Notice when someone shares something vulnerable and you're first. Your impulse is to offer an interpretation or solution rather than simply being with them in the feeling. Notice when you use phrases like, "I think I'm sad," instead of "I'm sad," the moment you put "I think" in front of a feeling. You've already created distance. Notice especially the moments when you feel the urge to explain your feelings, rather than express them. When someone asks how you are, and you launch into a 5-minute analysis of the various factors contributing to your current state, you're probably thinking about your feelings rather than feeling them. The feeling itself would be simpler. It's more direct. I'm overwhelmed, or I'm lonely, or I'm angry, and I don't fully know why yet. There's a practice Jung used called active imagination that can help bridge thinking and feeling. Unlike analysis, which takes you up into abstraction, active imagination drops you down into the symbolic realm where thinking and feeling can meet. You might imagine having a conversation with a part of yourself, the part that's always analyzing, always keeping distance. What would that part look like if it were a figure? What would it say if you asked it what it's protecting you from? What would it need in order to relax its vigilance? This isn't the same as thinking about yourself, because you're not trying to figure it out logically. You're letting the psyche speak in its own language, images, symbols, felt sense. Your thinking mind might want to direct this process, control it, make it make sense. But the practice is in letting go of that control, allowing images and feelings to arise that you didn't consciously construct. Trusting that the psyche has its own intelligence that operates beneath and beyond conscious thought. Another practice is simply naming feelings throughout the day without analyzing them. Not I'm feeling anxious because of that email I need to send, and this probably connects to my childhood pattern of seeking approval. But just I'm anxious. Period. Let the feeling be its own complete statement, without the story, without the explanation. This is incredibly difficult for deep thinkers because it feels insufficient. It's simple, like you're not using your full capacity. But that's exactly the point. You're practicing a different capacity, letting feeling have its own validity, without thought having to mediate every experience. The integration we're talking about also requires dealing with one of the deep thinker's most persistent shadows. The subtle arrogance that can develop when you're used to being the smartest person in the room, the one who sees what others miss. There's a way that thinking can become not just a defense, but a position of superiority, a way of remaining above the messy, irrational emotional world that ordinary people inhabit. Jung was frank about this shadow in himself. He writes about the danger of inflation, of identifying with the archetypal wise old man and believing you've transcended the ordinary human struggles. The psychologist James Hillman, following Jung, warns against the spiritual bypassing that happens. When we use insight to avoid transformation, when we can articulate profound truths, it's about the shadow but never actually face our own. When we understand archetypal patterns but don't apply that understanding to our actual lives, the antidote is humility. And humility for the thinker means acknowledging that understanding something is not the same as integrating it, that knowing about love is not the same as loving. That brilliance of mind doesn't make you more evolved as a human being, just differently gifted. It means recognizing that the person who can barely articulate their emotions but can sit with a friend in crisis without trying to fix anything has access to a wisdom you're still developing. This is particularly important for deep thinkers who discover psychology or spirituality or philosophy and become captivated by it. The danger is that you collect insights like trophies. You build ever more sophisticated maps of the psyche. You can discuss Jung's theories with remarkable nuance, but you remain fundamentally unchanged in how you actually live. You've just found a more elevated castle to hide in, a more sophisticated form of dissociation dressed up as wisdom. The true test of integration is not how much you know, but how you show up in the small, unglamorous moments of actual life. Can you be wrong and not need to explain why you're actually right? Can you be criticized and feel the sting of it without immediately defending? Can you witness someone else's pain without needing to solve it or put it in context? Can you be simple sometimes, even silly, without your mind rushing in to analyze the psychology of your own playfulness? These questions might seem to diminish the gift of thinking deeply, but they don't. They point toward what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in tension and allow a third thing to emerge. For the deep thinker, the opposites are thinking and feeling, head and heart, analysis and participation. And what emerges when you can hold both is something beyond either a way of being in the world that is both conscious and embodied, reflective and engaged, thoughtful and feeling. You become someone who can think deeply about the nature of human suffering and also weep at a friend's loss. You can analyze the archetypal patterns in a myth and also be moved by its beauty without needing to explain why. You can see through collective illusions and still participate in community with an open heart. You can be alone with your thoughts without that, aloneness being a rejection of connection. This is what wholeness looks like for the deep thinker, not the elimination of your gifts, but their integration into a fuller humanity. Not thinking less, but feeling more. It's not becoming someone else, but becoming more completely yourself. The psyche moves toward wholeness naturally if we let it. Your thinking developed so strongly for a reason it was needed. It served you. It remains a genuine strength. But the psyche doesn't want you to live only in one function, no matter how well developed it is. It wants you to engage all four functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition in their proper measure. It wants you to be complete. And here's the paradox: the deep thinkers often discover late in the process, when you finally develop the feeling function, when you learn to let yourself be touched and moved and connected, your thinking actually becomes more profound. Not less rigorous, not less sophisticated, but more grounded in actual human experience rather than abstract theory. Your insights have more weight because they come from someone who has lived them, not just thought about them. Jung said that the goal of individuation is not to become perfect, but to become whole, to integrate all the disparate parts of yourself into a conscious, functioning unity. For the deep thinker, this means bringing the exile home. It means inviting the heart back into conversation with the head. It means discovering that you don't have to choose between depth of thought and depth of feeling. You can have both. You can be both. The transformation happens slowly, in accumulated moments of choosing differently. Each time you let yourself feel without analyzing, building new neural pathways, developing the inferior function, moving toward balance. Each time you stay present in your body, instead of retreating into your head, you're choosing integration over fragmentation. Each time you let yourself be vulnerable instead of clever, you're practicing a different kind of courage than intellectual bravery. And gradually, you might notice something shifting. The tower of the mind becomes less of a refuge and more of a viewpoint, a place you can visit but don't have to live. The questions you ask yourself start to change. Not just what does this mean, but also how does this feel? Not just what's the pattern here, but also what matters to me in this moment. Not just what can I understand, but also how can I love? This is not the end of thinking deeply. It's the beginning of thinking and feeling and sensing and intuiting. Deeply, of engaging life with all of yourself rather than just the brilliant part. It's the discovery that you don't have to sacrifice your complexity or dumb yourself down to connect with others. You just have to risk being human, which includes being occasionally irrational, frequently vulnerable, and always more than just your thoughts about yourself. The deep thinker who has done this work becomes something rare and valuable. Someone who can hold both rigor and compassion. Who can see clearly and still be moved, who can articulate the truth and also feel its weight. This is the mature thinker, the integrated thinker, the person who has made the long journey from the head to the heart and brought the wisdom gained back to enrich both. Let me synthesize what we've explored. The thinking function is a profound gift that allows you to see patterns, grasp complexity, and navigate the world through meaning-making and analysis. But when overdeveloped as a defense against the feeling realm, thinking becomes a sophisticated form of dissociation, a castle that protects you from the pain of being human, but also isolates you from its richness. True individuation for the deep thinker means developing the feeling function with the same dedication you've given to thinking, learning to inhabit your emotions rather than just observe them, and discovering that wholeness requires both the head and the heart in conscious conversation. Here's what I want you to remember. Wisdom without feeling is just information. Thinking without heart is just escape in intellectual clothing. I invite you to leave a comment sharing one truth you've been thinking about but haven't let yourself fully feel. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward integrating it. Thank you for going deep with me today. This kind of exploration requires courage and self-honesty, and I honor that in you. If this video resonated, please give it a like and subscribe to Deep Psyche Lab for more journeys into Jungian psychology and the depths of the human experience. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss when we explore new territory together. This channel exists because of viewers like you who value depth, nuance, and the hard work of becoming whole. Remember, this channel explores psychology for self-understanding and is not a substitute for professional therapy. Until next time, may you think deeply and feel deeply, knowing that you don't have to choose between them, you get to be both.